Welcome to the SSI Orbit podcast, a forum that explores everything pertinent to digital trust. And I'm your host, Mathieu Claude. I was looking at the latest air travel outlook for 2024, and it's looking like it's going to be the biggest year volume-wise in history for global passenger traffic. So global air travel passenger traffic had dropped after COVID, but had basically in 2023, we're almost back to where we were in 2019 pre-COVID, and 2024 is looking like we're going to pass that. I've flown quite a few times this year. I know you've flown quite a few times this year, maybe a little bit too much for our likings, but I'm sure a lot of the listeners here have also traveled through airports. And when traveling through airports, I start to think more and more now that, having been in this digital identity space for a little while now, of all the different things that are happening there. So maybe a good starting point for the conversation today is, who is that organization? Who is the body that helps develop specifications, standards, alignments on an international standpoint, that makes sure that whether I'm coming into an airport in Canada, the US, or even in Europe, that there's, it's pretty smooth. I'm able to use the same documents. So maybe we could start from that standpoint, which is more of just from a governance body standpoint. Who facilitates all of this?
The facilitator is a UN agency called the International Civil Aviation Organization. So they were given the authority, I think, back in the 30s under a Geneva Convention, I believe, to exactly what you said, to govern it. Now, you also threw in there some of the technical standards bits. So what ICAO and its 190 plus member state body relies on ISO for its standards. So within ISO, there's a lot of subcommittees. Subcommittee 17, Working Group 3, deal with travel documents, and specifically, ICAO's travel documents. So ICAO is the governing body, and ISO SC17 Working Group 3 is the standards body that brings us the standards. I'll end that thread with the ultimate document for passports and e-passports is ICAO Doc 9303, and that calls out several ISO standards.
ICAO works with, I guess, if you split it up into two kind of side of things, one being just the governance business side, interactions with the different countries or states, and then on the second side with the standards. If we just talk about that first side, so with the United States, Canada are part of, what's the dynamics between the countries and ICAO, and how did that result in these passports being created, or at least alignment on that?
Yeah, so the ICAO headquarters is up in Montreal, and when you go there, it looks like a UN entity. In other words, they have a big auditorium with a bunch of chairs with each member state listed on there, and they have regular meetings, sometimes regional, sometimes international, where all the member states literally, show up, and they have interpreters, I think typically 4 or 5 languages, live interpretation, and they discuss what's been going well, what's not been going so well, what changes they want at these meetings, where again, there's hundreds of member states that talk about this. There's a dedicated new technologies working group, which is more on the technical side. I know you're asking about governance here, but that's where the I wish I had ultimately winds up, like from those meetings where they talk about governance and what's going well and what they want changed. That's ultimately where those business decisions and requests ultimately get filtered down to the new technology working group.
And it seems like authentication at airports through passports, not everywhere, but there's a trend where they're increasingly becoming more like machine authentication. So I'm maybe getting less stamps in my passport, but when I show up, I have to put my passport inside of a machine. There's some selfies, some biometrics that happen there. So that's kind of happening today with the physical passport. So is that kind of the transition, I guess, from just physical to digital? Because my input that I'm giving still relies on something physical. And I guess at the same time, like different countries have their different roadmaps. So I guess they have to adhere to certain rules, but not every country is going to be on the same pace of accelerating the digitization of these processes as well. So what am I trying to get to here is borders increasingly relying on machine authentication, just accelerating the digitization of kind of a physical passport booklet.
Yeah, so I think we're seeing more automation enabled by the e-passport in general. But there's a couple things in what you said. So why are they doing it? I think there's two main reasons. One you said is the document authentication. With an e-passport, the E for electronic, as opposed to regular passport, which has no chip in it. Basically, an ISO 14443 defines the air interface, an NFC read or RFID read. That's what differentiates an e-passport from a passport. There are still countries that are not issuing e-passports. Totally paper. It is DOC 9303 compliant, but it's not an e-passport. It's not an e-MRTD, as it's called, machine-readable travel document. It's still a machine-readable travel document, but it's optically machine-readable, not electronically machine-readable. Anyhow, so the trend in this automation that you speak of is, again, to electronically authenticate the document to prove its authenticity and integrity. Authenticity based on the cryptographic country signing cert, and integrity based on basically the I'll call it checksum. When the digital signing is done, it has they call it SOD, a data signing object, so that you could tell that all the data within the logical data structure is intact. It hasn't been manipulated since the country that issued it, signed it. So you're looking at, so the first thing you're doing when you do that electronic read is determining the authenticity and integrity. The other aspect of an e-passport, which in 1995, when it was introduced, it was called a biometric passport. ICAO decided, and its member states, the best way to bind that document to the presenter is through biometrics. In other words, is Dan presenting Dan's passport, or is Dan presenting Matthew's passport? So the best way to bind the presenter of the document to the authorized holders through biometrics. So in 1995, they changed DOC 9303 to mandate the inclusion of a photo in the e-passport. So in that automation, apart from the document authentication part of the automation, the other part, when you walk up to an e-gate or a kiosk that's reading the passport, is to take a live photo of the subject presenting the passport, like in an e-gate, and matching it against the photo in the chip. So those are the two main things that we're seeing a trend of more and more out in the borders, is that automation to do the biometric comparison of the presenter of the document to the document, and to check the authenticity and integrity of the document.
So whether it's a border agent or a machine, these checks are happening. So if it's a border agent, they have a reader, I guess, themselves to do these certificate checks, and then the integrity checks as well on the data signing object, and then the machine would do the same thing, and it just takes my selfie and does a comparison of the two. Is that accurate?
Absolutely correct. The refinement that I would say is when the border guard does it, and they do exactly what you said. They typically, like when I just was coming back last week from France, they do entry and exit in Europe. So on exit, they took my passport, they put it on the scanner, and then the officer looked at the photo from the passport and looked at me. Now, what NIST and other entities have proven is that modern facial recognition is more accurate at recognizing unfamiliar faces than humans. So yes, most border guards check the authenticity of the document electronically and do a manual facial compare, which again is less accurate than modern facial recognition. So an e-gate will probably do a better job at recognizing, the live face against the passport face than a human.
Do all countries have to do both entry and exit kind of validations? How does one decide which ones to do? I'm assuming everyone has to do entry, but exit maybe is not required.
Right. So the US, Canada, UK, we all do entry immigration checks only. In the US, we're trying to do biometric exit, or exit in general, but we're going from no exit control to, as a result of September 11th, Congress said in 2002, I believe it was, maybe 2003, that within 2 years, Department of Homeland Security shall have a comprehensive biometric entry exit system. Well, we got entry done in like 2005 timeframe, biometric entry, but not biometric exit, because we have no exit control. So to go from no exit control to biometric exit proved to be a huge challenge. We're getting there in terms of airports, but land border is going to be a challenge. Now in Europe, they have today entry exit control. It's manual, as we were just talking about, and there still is passport stamping. So they physically stamp your passport on entry and on exit. Now with the entry exit system legislation adopted a few years ago, the European IT agency called ELISA is standing up the entry exit system technology to do comprehensive biometric entry and exit for all third country nationals. So we will have a biometric component to our entry and exit as third country nationals coming into and leaving Europe, and that will replace passport stamping. Your next question may be, well, why is there passport stamping on entry exit to begin with? It's primarily to determine overstays. In the U.S., we had I-94s and I-95s. These were tokens that are used for arrival departure coupons, and we were using that paper-based means to determine overstays, to check, because on entry we determine when someone arrived. On exit, you're supposed to return your I-94 coupon, and then we could tell that you left. We got rid of I-94s for airlines several years ago, because now airlines, we use the airline manifest to determine when you departed. And as you might be able to tell, it's fairly accurate, but not that accurate. And because there's no biometrics involved, it might be Mathieu exited the country on Dan's information, on Dan's ticket, and you'd be recorded as Dan exiting when I never did. So that's why, one of the reasons why the legislation in the US is there to do biometric entry and exit for all third country nationals. And again, we're getting there, not quite there. But Europe, again, the biometric entry exit system that's coming online is going to give more accurate overstay information to Europe. Again, they're doing entry and exit stamping today, but again, it's travel document based, not biometric based.
Is there, just like there's alignment through ICAO on just the governance, the types of travel documents, and the standards used for that, both for physical and digital? How does biometrics work between countries as well? Is there a similar organization or similar standards that are in place to make sure that there's people are speaking the same language or using the same technologies? And it may be worth taking a step back and just talking about, we say biometrics a lot, but what are we really talking about here when we're saying biometrics in regard to travel?
Yeah, yeah, no, it's good question. So within the ICAO Doc 9303, they call out the logical data structure that includes all the biographic and biometric bits that make up a passport. So what's required is data group one, which is pretty much the same information that you could read on the data page of your passport. Then data group two is required, and that's a photo. So to your question, how do they ensure interoperability with that photo? What specs? So they call out ISO specs on the interchange standard for that. It was 19794-5. It's now 39794-5, and that's an interchange standard. It says, how is that photo packaged? And it has quality metrics in that. What we're working on in ISO is a pure quality standard called 29794-5. It's in the works. It's not done yet. When it's done, we presume that ICAO will adopt that standard. Right now, the current ICAO spec calls out ISO 39794-5, which again is an interchange standard that has quality metrics in it. There's things in that standard like resolution, typically like the number of pixels between the eyes. Like there's I think 20 some odd plus or minus quality parameters. There's things like the resolution, background noise, blur, hotspots, mouth open is a quality metric. So that's why when you go to take your passport photo, they say don't smile, just do a normal pose. There's things like how much of the frame you fill with your head, basically. And for ICAO, they call it full frontal. So no side, no pitch, no yaw. So all those things are specced out, including the resolution, including that it's a JPEG image, not a template. There's some debate early on when the passport chips were slow and did not have a lot of memory. So you can imagine a photo from a modern digital camera could be gigabytes, tens of megabytes, and trying to jam that on a chip would be impossible back in '95 when they created the biometric passport. So they settled on a JPEG photo with no more compression than 15:1 compression ratio and a bunch of resolution specs. So that's how they got interoperability. It's just a photo, not a template. And just for the audience, so templates are typically derived using a proprietary biometric matching vendors feature extractor, as it's called. And what it does is it saves space. So if you share templates, you're talking hundreds or thousands of bytes instead of kilobytes. That a photo is typically 25, 50 kilobytes. So a template would save space, but it locks you into that version of that vendor. Now, there are ISO templates that are interoperable, but the trade-off there is you get interoperability, but you get a higher error rate. So proprietary templates give you much better matching performance in terms of accuracy. But again, it locks you into that version of that vendor. So even if you preferred vendor A, if you use their template and then vendor a year from now comes up with a new algorithm, well, your passport that's typically good for 10 years is locked into that version of that template. That's why it's photos. And if the template you want to use is from vendor A, then fine, you extract those features, you generate that template in your eGate live. You don't put it in the chip of the passport. That was the compromise.
When you say accuracy of the photo, so you're comparing it against something. So if we just look at a normal air travel where I'm doing both entries and exits, so I'll start with an exit check because I'm leaving, and then I'll do an entry check, and then when let's say I'm just doing a simple trip and I'm going back home, I'm going to exit the place that I visited and I'm going to enter the place again. So if there's four checks there, the exit entry, when you mentioned the accuracy of the photos. So what is this being compared against in different locations? Like what are these systems of records in different locations, or is the foreign country I'm visiting just comparing my biometrics against kind of my home base? What's happening there in terms of establishing accuracy?
Right. So, okay. So a couple main points there. So, the first main point is all biometric systems are probabilistic, not deterministic, in that all biometric systems have type 1 and type 2 errors. That's what I'm talking about in terms of accuracy. It's not of the photo itself, but the quality of the photo will impact matching accuracy. What accuracy is really on the matcher. And all biometric matchers will have type 1, which are false rejects, and type 2, which are false matches. So the false reject is Mathieu is using Mathieu's passport trying to get through an E-gate, and it says, no, it's not, you're not the real Matt. So that's a Mathieu. That's a false reject. That's a convenience type of parameter. Whereas a false acceptor, false match is, Matthew's using Dan's passport and says, okay, go ahead. Well, that's a security, so we want to keep the false matches as low as possible. And what system owners should be doing is looking at the receiver operating characteristic curves of the matcher vendor they choose. And they typically say, I want that false match rate or false accept rate to be as low as possible. Let's say like 1 in 100,000. Now, if you select that and you look in that characteristic curve, when you're at 1 in 100,000 false matches, your false reject might be, let's say, 1 in 100. But as a border officer, you're concerned about convenience, but let's say less concerned about convenience and more concerned about security. So if Mathieu is rejected 1 in 100 times, okay, that's acceptable if I'm going to make sure that I'm going to let fewer bad guys who are fewer imposters through. So that's the one thing. The false all biometric matches have false rejects and false matches. Now, the other dimension is, to your question, is what is it comparing against? In a lot of countries, they take the live face, they generate the feature, they use vendor A or whoever the vendor is to generate features, and then they read your passport photo and they generate features from that. And they do a one-to-one match, the features from your live face against the features from your passport face. Like in Canada, for example, they do that comparison at the kiosk, and then they delete everything within 24 hours. In the US, on the other hand, what we're seeing, let's say with the expedited arrivals. So because CBP has photos of US citizens and of third country nationals, if they encountered them before, if you're a first-time visitor, let's say from the UK, it's a visa waiver country, then right, CBP wouldn't have your info. But if you had crossed before, or if you had a visa, they would have all your information. So when you walk up to CBP, they're getting your live face, extracting features, and comparing it against the photo that they have on file. If you had interacted with CBP before. If you hadn't interacted with CBP before, it goes back to what we talked about a minute ago. The CBP would scan your passport, get the photo from the passport, and either the inspector would look at you and look at the passport photo and do the manual match, or some of them, they have a camera where they would do the live one, live face against the chip face. And then CBP has a retention policy, so that those background photos that we mentioned, Customs and Border Protection does have a 75-year retention on their biometrics that are on file for all third country nationals. Now, that EES system that I mentioned, which will go live, the last I heard was November of this year, of 24. What they negotiated when they finalized the legislation is a 3-year retention policy. So for all third country nationals, the first time I arrive in Europe, I'm going to give 4 fingerprints for my right hand and a face. That gets enrolled into the entry-exit system, and it will stay there for 3 years so that every subsequent interaction, the member state will use either finger or face to biometrically authenticate me on subsequent entries and exits. And as long as all my entries and exit match, after 3 years, it gets wiped out. Then the next time I visit, it's going to start over again. 4 fingerprints in the right hand and face, 3 years. Canada, like I said, there is no retention when they collect biometrics. It's typically, I think it was 24 hours, like when you use the kiosk in Canada.
Yeah, okay. So that was quite helpful. So we're really just talking about comparison of a photo, which you said is a JPEG image that is in my document versus just my live biometric that is taken, and there's a comparison done on that. For folks that don't have passports, that have, like, they'll travel with a visa, or even if we're talking about just like local air travel where you could use something like a driver's license, do these things have the same levels of integrity, I guess, or the similar standards around how images are put into these things? I don't even know if they're electronic to begin with. And then how biometric assessments are done. Like, if you're traveling with a visa or a driver's license, if it's in a local case, what are the similarities or differences between the processes that you've been describing so far as we've been talking about passports?
Yeah, there's a lot of good roots in that question. So the I'll give the U.S. for example. So the U.S. has designated 41 countries as visa waiver countries. So and why are they visa waiver? There's a couple of reasons why these countries have proven to their citizens have not overstayed their welcome to whatever degree Department of State says. So they're kind of like most favored nation sort of status, if you will. The other dimension is their passport issuance process is known to be solid, that they are very careful in their passport production, very diligent. They follow ICAO guidelines under the name of TRIP, the Traveler Identification Program, where they talk about not just quality of the photos in there, but the security of how do they keep the passport books secure before they're issued so that a criminal organization can't get a hold of them, all that. So there's 41 visa waiver countries where, again, we trust their passports a bit more than others. Everybody else is a visa country. So we say, you know what, whatever, I don't want to pick on a country, Uzbekistan, whatever. We don't know, or we don't trust your passport issuing process, and you want to visit the US, have your citizens visit a consular office. We'll collect 10 prints and a photograph at that point. We'll do background checks with those fingerprints against various databases, including FBI's and Department of Homeland Security's, where we're checking for criminal activity. And when you arrive, we're going to check to make sure that the fingerprints and or face match those that were collected at the consular office. So we're not even looking necessarily at the passport at that point, again, because we don't trust it as much. That's why it's a visa country. So that's one dimension. So that's another dimension. I'll go back to the European entry-exit system legislation. Well, they know that countries like the US and Canada and UK have poor quality photos that are easily morphed. What does that mean? So when I went to get my passport, I took my own photo with my camera, and I manipulated it. What? Now, I didn't create a morph, which is taking, let's say, 3 images and morphing them together. So any of those 3 people can get through the e-gate using that document. I just changed the contrast on mine because it was a little bit dark, but I manipulated the photo. And then I sent that in, and it was poor quality, and there was no quality checks that I could tell that Department of State did. They just took it and then cryptographically signed it and said, good to go. The European entry-exit legislation in Article 15 says, oh, no, no, no. When this third country national arrives, do not use passports. Take 4 fingerprints from the right hand, take a live photo, enter that into ES, and every subsequent entry or exit, compare it against that biometric, not the biometric in the e-passport, with an exclusion of if the officer that's collecting the 4 fingerprints in the face just could not get good quality for whatever reason. They had left them out, and then they said, okay, if you can't do it for some reason, use the passport photo. But that's exception case only. And this goes, again, I need to emphasize this. This goes for digital travel credentials, which are derived from the passport book. If you have a passport book from a country that does not do, 3 things. Ensure that the photo is captured live by a trusted entity that does a quality check, and that proves to a certain degree that individual is unique within the context. With passport, I should be unique within the country. How did Department of State prove that I'm the one and only Dan Bachenheimer with this passport number? And that's supposed to be part of this traveler identification program. How accurate was that? Like in the case of India, for example, in Aadhaar, they use 10 fingerprints and 2 irises to deduplicate 1.3 billion residents of India. In the US, we have face only and demographics. So whether you're male, female, or of a certain age, they use those to filter the data. And as soon as you start introducing demographic information, you're introducing more errors than biometric errors only.
This has all been super helpful context. I wanted to talk about the digital travel credential on this episode with you, and it felt like it was worth just spending a little bit of time just understanding the general landscape as it exists today, because I think it'll help just understand how we're evolving or what the digital travel credential looks like. So just basic off the bat, you kind of just mentioned that in one of your previous comments that it's derived from the passport book. But if we just take a step back, what is the digital travel credential and how does it relate to all of the stuff that we've been talking about so far in this conversation?
Right. So what ICAO has done is they created a pathway for the 3 types of digital travel credentials. Why? Because right now, today, what we've been talking about is presenting a passport book in person to a border officer. What if in the case of like an electronic travel authorization, which we required to do to visit certain countries, but it's all text-based, and it's text that I, as a traveler, would fill out on a web page. So what the member states that participate in ICAO said, wouldn't it be cool, wouldn't it be great if I could get the cryptographically signed information from a passport ahead of time, before the traveler arrives at my border? And so what ICAO did was they said, okay, let's work on that. And they came up with these 3 types of digital travel credentials. DTC type 1, digital travel credential type 1, is, as we just mentioned, derived from an already provisioned e-passport. And so with many mobile phones today, the traveler can basically read the chip of the passport and derive, as it's called, the same logical data structure that we talked about a few minutes ago, that has the two required data groups. Data group 1 and data group 2 are the only mandatory data groups from the e-passport, which has, I believe it's 16 data groups. So data group 1, just to refresh, is the demographic or biographic information, pretty much that you see on the data page, and data group 2 is the photo. So what the DTC spec says is just that: DG1, DG2 with the data signing object, to make sure that the cryptographic integrity is there and it has the same country signing cert. So it's basically the DTC type 1 is basically a copy of the data within the chip, but without the need to have a physical document at the point where you share it. Now, one of the requirements for travel under DTC is to have the book with you. So that's a requirement, and it's up to the country to say present it or not. But the beauty of the DTC is that most countries already have legislation to say, for international, for cross-border travel, you need to be traveling on an ICAO Doc 9303 approved travel credential. DTCs are Doc 9303 approved because it's the same cryptographic integrity as your passport. There's a few DTC Type 1 pilots going on today in Canada and Europe. I think in Southeast Asia, they have some DTC pilots going on. And again, the really good thing about that is you could get that same cryptographically signed information before the traveler hits the border, so countries can start processing, right? Now, if Mathieu gets a hold of my DTC, Mathieu could share it and say that Dan's could be crossing the border, and they'll start processing Dan's information. But when Mathieu shows up at the border and claims to be Dan, Mathieu hopefully is going to have some problems, right? So yes, countries could start processing it. But again, if it's a US passport, I could very easily do a morph of Dan and Mathieu, put that in my passport, and then both of us could get through an e-gate. And a lot of times, both of us would be recognized as legitimate by a human as well. There's been less testing of that. I know countries have tested the morphing problem and shown that it's a real problem. And one of the things that ICAO said, because ICAO could just provide guidance. So what ICAO New Technology Working Group was contemplating was putting in a flag in the logical data structure to determine whether the photo was taken live or not. And then it's up to the member state. If the photo wasn't taken live, should that person be allowed to go through an e-gate? And if it wasn't taken live, presumably they would go through manual inspection, and the inspector would be looking out for potential morph. And there's some morph detection algorithms that are being used more and more today to look for morphs. Okay, and then DTC Type 2 is, okay, so DTC Type 1, once you derive the credential, they call that a virtual component, and your passport book is the physical component. In DTC Type 2, the final specs aren't out yet, but the proposition is, well, DTC Type 2 is the issuing agency that issues your passport book. The physical component will now issue you a virtual component, basically, so you don't have to derive it yourself, which, to Joe or Jane's citizen may be difficult, right? Maybe they don't have a phone, maybe they're not digitally proficient. So they'll say, okay, Type 2, the issuing agency will issue you a virtual component straight away so that you could use it the way you want. And the physical component could be a book, could be something else. It could be like a USB key or something like that. In type 3, they go totally digital. There's no physical component. It's 100% virtual component. Again, issued by the issuing agency that would issue your passport. But yeah, so those are what's in play. But the again, the it's powerful in that countries are already have approved ICAO Doc 9303 documents for cross-border travel, but it's only for cross-border travel by government use only. What ICAO doesn't contemplate, because they have 193 member states that are concerned with cross-border travel, they're not concerned with you opening up a bank account with using a passport. Um, so what does that mean? So in order to check the cryptographic authenticity of the document, you need access to ICAO's public key directory or some master list. ICAO disallows the commercial use of their PKD, of their public key directory. Airlines can use it if directed by their member state to check the validity of a passport, because that's what countries do ask airlines to do that. But commercial use is disallowed. ICAO has had a trial going on where you could apply as a commercial entity to use their PKD for certain things like COVID credentials, for example. But right now, in general, it's disallowed for commercial use. The other reason why it's not really fit for purpose for commercial use is there's no selective disclosure. You're either getting DG1 and DG2 in its entirety, or you're not getting anything. There's no selective disclosure. And it was by design. I'm not criticizing the ICAO folks for doing this. It was intended uses for cross-border travel by governments. Governments don't want you to say, well, I'm not giving you my birth date. You don't need to know my birth. They want the birth date. They'll get the birth date, right? Whereas if you're going into, if you showed your passport to go to a bar to prove you're over 21, you're giving them all the information, whether it's the book or the DTC. You have to give them all that information. And if all they need to know is that you're over 21, do they really need your birth date and your same thing with a driver's license? Do they really need your birth date and your home address and whether you're an organ donor or not? No. But yeah, so DTC is great for cross-border travel for government use only, but it's not privacy enhancing. You asked about driver's licenses. So most driver's licenses, regular plastic ones, don't have a chip in it. They're not cryptographic devices. They don't have cryptographic signatures. Now they can have a barcode that's cryptographically signed that you could go back to the issuing agency to make sure that the integrity and authenticity of the barcode is legit. Those that do have a barcode is typically the textual information, not a photograph, because the photograph would be kind of huge. So most physical driver's license, what they do, like what TSA does, they put it in a machine, they read the teeny, like 1 centimeter by 1 centimeter photograph, they digitize it, and they compare that against a live face. That's, you're just asking for problems because the resolution is very low on that. So there's no chip, so there's no photo in the chip. Where you have digital signatures, it's typically on the biographic part. MDLs are different. So mobile driver's licenses, according to ISO 18013-5 and soon -7, do have selective disclosure, do have cryptographic elements that you can prove its authenticity and integrity and get selective disclosure. And yes, there's a photo that is supposed to comply with ISO quality standards within the MDL spec, and you can use that. The main thing that the MDL doesn't contemplate that other decentralized digital identity constructs do is zero knowledge proofs. So in that bar example, so I have a Maryland mobile driver's license. So if Maryland wanted, the Motor Vehicle Authority could issue three, they call them MDocs, three cryptographically signed components of my mobile driver's license. One that says I'm over 18, so I could vote. One that says I'm over 21, so I could go to a bar. One that says I'm over 25, so I could rent a car, let's say. But they'd have to be issued by the trusted agency at the time of issuance. Whereas W3C compliant verifiable credentials, you could derive those cryptographic proofs in using some protocols on the fly, basically. Where giving your birth date cryptographically signed, you could derive cryptographic proofs from that cryptographically signed birth date to prove you're over 18, 21, or 25. That's called a predicate proof.
What does the ecosystem of verifiers look like? Like even because the similarities between the DTC and a mobile driver's license is that they're focused on a specific credential, specific use case. However, on the mobile driver's license side of things, there are many use cases where relying parties or verifiers will use it. You just described a few based on just the age checks, but it could just be general identification for just general types of interactions as well. There's plenty of them, right? Like I could prove that I am who I'm claiming to be when my bank teller is trying to help me do a financial transaction. I could use an MDL for that, but for the digital travel credential, it's just for a specific use case. So as this moves digital, it doesn't seem like the ecosystem of verifiers changes very much. And if that's the case, then like what are the big benefits? You mentioned that you could kind of submit data to the proper agency or whoever needs to get your data before you're traveling, but what are the big benefits that are being identified here? Because it's less of like a verifiable credential story, less of even a mobile driver's license story where you could imagine a lot of digital transformation happening and a lot of more value being created within an ecosystem. This is for a specific set of verifiers and it remains that. So what are the big benefits of moving towards a digital travel credential?
The digital travel credential specifically, in the ICAO sense of the term, is really still relegated to cross-border travel. And the big advantage is, well, for the member state that's getting the visitor that they could process ahead of time, the big advantage for the traveler is presumably if you share that information ahead of time, you'll get the benefit of hopefully expedited travel. That if you provided that ahead of time, maybe you could use these 5 lanes that are dedicated to pre-process folks as opposed to everybody else. But yeah, to your point, it is a very closed ecosystem. Even the MDLs, their equivalent of the ICAO PKD is being stood up by, they call it American Association of Motor Vehicle Authorities, but it really covers, AMVA covers North America. Well, they say North America. I know Canada and the US. I don't know if it includes Mexico. So they're setting up a very similar PKD. Now, there was just AMVA, the Better Identity Coalition, and IDEMIA just testified before Congress about what's next, basically. And ACLU was on the panel as well. Those 4 entities. It was just this past week. And it goes to kind of what you're asking is, well, who could use this ecosystem? Who could use this and for what reason? And ACLU was, I think, right in certain aspects in that it's too much too soon. We can't answer Matthew's question. Who can use it? In that bar example, why would I trust this bartender or this convenience store operator to get my information electronically? If they say I need this information, under what authority, right? Well, right now I show my driver's license and they could, I guess they can memorize it. But once I share my data and they have my photograph in digital form and they have all my data, why should I trust them? And how do I know what legal constructs are there that says they have to delete that within X number of minutes or hours. Otherwise, they're going to be fined, 10 grand or whatever that is. There's nothing. And that was kind of the AC. Actually, all four presenters basically said the same thing, that it's, these MDLs sound great and there's some ISO specs, but what is Congress doing? What are the legal ramifications to protect the consumer when they share that data? How do I know that, again, that they can legitimately, legally ask for this information? Similar things are going on with Europe in their EU digital identity wallet. But their ecosystem is going to be the equivalent of the PKD, are the trust lists that each member state has. One of the big questions, and they're just the Trilog just signed off on the latest version of the architecture and reference framework. The Trilog is the Commission, the Parliament, and the Council. Those are the three legs of the Trilog. But when I asked the Commission, how do I know? Because the legislation says that I share my PID, my personal identity information, when required by law. So if I go to Matthew's House of Pancakes or whatever, and they say, and I need to prove that I'm whatever I need to prove, how do I know that they're legally allowed to ask for that information? There's a gap. There's nothing there in the legislation. Oh, it'll be in the implementing act. So I think the same is going to be true for the MDL. And it goes back to your question, Matthew, is what's this ecosystem like? Well, we have the technical bits of the protocols and exchanges. We know what those can be, but it goes back to governance, I think. And we don't have the governance aspect. What are you legally allowed to ask for? And what are the checks and balances to prove that A, you can ask for it, and B, once you get that information, what can you do with it? And how long can you hold it? Who can you share it with? Can you resell it? All those things we don't know.
Which is very straightforward in this travel ecosystem, because these things are in place today, and if you're restricted to using it just in these existing use cases, then it's just you're not going to have all of these concerns with sharing the digital travel credential. And do you foresee, I guess, a couple of questions here bucketed together. You mentioned ISO standards earlier. Is the digital travel credential based on a similar like ISO EID standard that like a mobile driver's license is based off of, or is it something completely different? And then when we talk about wallets, I guess we would assume if it's just made for one use case that they're going to sit just within their own applications, their own wallets that are going to be managed by the countries or member states of ICAO that allow you to kind of share this data with other member states beforehand. Like they'll just be these existing applications to do so. So I guess just a couple questions there on the standard, and then just on how these DTCs are going to sit inside of applications, or if we want to call them wallets.
Right. Okay, some good questions there. So right now, the DTC Type 1 is made up of, like I was saying before, from ICAO Doc 9303, Data Group 1, which is totally text, and Data Group 2, which is the photo. The photo itself, whether it's DTC or e-passport, is not under control of, according to the ICAO spec, should conform to ISO 39794-5. So the ISO connection for a DTC really only applies to DG2, the photo. And that's primarily for quality and the way it's formatted, because 39794-5 is an interchange standard. In other words, how is it packaged for sharing? And it has quality components. Now, the entire data structure, the logical data structure of a DTC, the only thing that ICAO tells us, the techies, is it's an ASN.1 format. Now, how does it get to the wallet? How does it get from the wallet to the to the country I'm traveling to? Let's say undefined at this point. Um, what it's probably going to happen, much like the MDL, it's going to rely on ISO standards such as the 23220 series. The 23220 series -3, I believe, is issuance, and -4 is usage. So how does an MDL get into an MDL wallet, if you will? Or how does a DTC get into a DTC wallet? It may be in the future ISO 23220-3, and how does it get shared from my wallet to a relying party or to a verifier? It's probably going to be ISO 23220-4. But right now, that it is not spec'd out for the DTC, and it's emerging for the MDL. So, like for the MDL, right now, 18013-5 is for proximity use only. So, how does it get from the wallet to a verifier? One of three ways, right? Bluetooth low energy, NFC, or QR code. In -7, how does it get from my wallet to the UK or Uzbekistan in my last example? That is probably going to be ISO 23220-4. The usage. Yep. So that's and for the passport book, I think that was part of your question. There's a bunch of ISO standards in there because it has a chip. And so, like I said, the air interface protocol for the chip. So when you read it, like on eGate, you're reading the chip from an antenna. Well, that's defined by ISO 1443 AB for that air interface protocol. The chip itself is ISO 7816, for the physical format of the chip and all that, blah, blah, blah. So there's a bunch of ISO standards within that. And like I said, the photo itself is ISO 39794-5 and blah, blah, blah. There's a bunch of ISO standards in the passport book. But I think in the DTC, the only one I'm familiar with is for the photo itself.
So really, like having a DTC is going to be a benefit to the traveler to make it more seamless to get in and out, or out and then into different places. And so if we think about different programs that exist today, like we're starting to see, I've actually seen this in the airports now. I think in the San Francisco airport a few months ago, like if you have this clear application, you're able to kind of go quicker, or we have these like Nexus programs that you're able to get in and out quicker. That just means, I guess, that they've done identity verification. They've done background checks. They've reduced the risk to make it, I guess, more seamless for you to travel. But we could maybe start achieving some of these same things by having DTCs. Is that a reasonable comparison, I guess?
Yeah, it's a good comparison that the traveler, by sharing information ahead of time, can maybe may be able to access speedier processing, right? Like Nexus is a trusted traveler lane. And having been chief engineer for that for a number of years, the main difference there is you gave your 10 prints and your face, and they're doing continuous vetting. So what does that mean? So when you apply, you're checked against these terrorist watch lists, these criminal watch lists, to make sure you're not a criminal. And every time there's something added to that watch list, it's checked against us, the trusted travelers. So if I applied and I'm a good guy, and then a year later I get in trouble criminally, then my fingerprints or whatever, would show up under criminal activity, and they'd probably kick me out of the program. So that's what continuous vetting means. You're continuously getting checked against these watch lists. So there's registered travelers, which are just that. They're registered. They're known. but they might not be trusted in that they're not going through all these background checks. But because you're known, so like in the UK, they had a registered traveler program, and I was. They didn't they didn't collect biometrics from me. They just said you have to cross the border 4 times, and not have any problems. Then you could start using the e-gates. So that was a registered traveler. I'm a German registered traveler. I didn't provide any biometrics. I just give them my passport book. They put it on file. And now when I cross into Germany, in and out of Germany, I could use the e-gates. Now, because of their Schengen law, they still have to stamp my passport, but I don't have to wait in the line with the rest of the Americans. I could go through that lane. That's a registered traveler lane. Because I registered and they kind of know me, they didn't do a background check, a fingerprint-based background check, but because I've crossed the border a number of times and I registered with them, then they've had no problems with Dan. They let me continue going through that. But that's the difference between registered traveler and trusted traveler.
So looking forward, you mentioned there's some pilots happening throughout the world for DTC Type 1, which is self-derived. And just to recap, DTC Type 2 is authority-derived, so it gets issued by the authority. And DTC Type 3 is it gets issued by the authority, but there's no need for a physical booklet anymore.
Right.
So in terms of adoption, so there's pilot projects happening in that first DTC Type 1 bucket, which is self-derived. So I'm able to tap my passport against my phone, and the application is able to pick up information in there. And I guess there's testing happening with different airports, different customs authorities. What does kind of the state of these pilots look like today, and how do you see this evolving? I guess we often talk about like how verifiable credential adoption is going and mobile driver's license adoption is going. I'd be curious to hear your thoughts of how you see the adoption of DTCs happening in the near medium future.
Yeah, I think we're going to see more and more adoption, especially pilots. But again, the DTCs are just like the passport book. Right now there's no stamping, or like we talked about the ETA, the electronic travel authorization. Well, if you had a trusted wallet, you could have a bunch of things in that wallet, including an ETA. You could have entry-exit stamps in there. You could have COVID credentials in there. Right now, the logical data structure of the DTCs don't support that. Now, maybe when the final DTC Type 2 spec comes out, you will be able to have other elements in the logical data structure besides DG1 and DG2. Maybe you can have something for an ETA or something for others. Now, what ICAO has, or a visa, for example, like a truly, I'm hesitating because right now we have this concept of an e-visa, which you apply and you get electronically, versus a paper visa that's stuck into your passport. An e-visa is typically an ETA, electronic travel authorization, or an ESTA, or something like that. They kind of confuse the issue by calling them e-visas. But what ICAO is talking about is having a visual digital seal. It's a barcode. It's not electronic, but that could replace some of these things like a Visa sticker. But now it's a barcode that could be stuck in your passport book, or it could be a barcode that's physically in your wallet, so you could share a PDF of your of that visual digital seal. So I think that could come in, and they'll probably call it an e-visa at that point. But I see that being layered on top of a DTC, not being added. Same thing with COVID credentials, right? If we ever have a health emergency again, whether it's mad cow disease or COVID or something where you have to prove health, something health related, you could have one of these barcodes in your wallet that you could share again ahead of time and or at the border. But I see those type of things. Whereas if in a W3C world, they're all just verifiable credentials. That could be shared using selective disclosure, could be shared using the secure protocol that surrounds W3C compliant verifiable credentials. Again, here, DTC, there's no protocol to share DTCs yet. There's no protocol to share visual digital seals yet, right? But that's why I say you're just layering on various credentials in your wallet with a TBD on how do you securely share those in a privacy-enhancing fashion. We just don't know yet. And the MDL spec, if you just decompose it and talk about a collection of MDocs, that could be a way to share it. But motor vehicle authorities are not necessarily in the business of provisioning COVID credentials or e-visas, right? So who's going to be the responsible authority for that?
I guess I see it's more logical to see MDocs or mobile driver's licenses sitting in the same applications or wallets as different verifiable credentials, because there's no restriction on how these things could be shared with relying parties. There's obviously different protocols and different things evolving, but you can imagine these things kind of sitting together and having benefit for the citizen or the consumer because they're sitting in one application versus the DTC, I guess, because it's just single purpose use. You wonder whether it even makes any sense to have that sitting in that same conceptual wallet or having an agent on top of it versus like, I just want to use whatever my travel authority's application is and I'm able to have it in there, and it just makes my life a little easier. It helps me travel quicker and reduces friction when I'm crossing borders and at the airports and such. So it'll be interesting to see how this thing evolves and what the strategy is for, I guess, implementers of wallets and applications to see where these things sit in and whether or not they need to sit in together or not. But at this present moment, the way you're explaining it, it really sounds like because it's single purpose only and because ICAO doesn't want any commercial use of their PKI system, it probably makes less sense for these things to sit in the same wallets that where you would have verifiable credentials. But maybe I'm totally off with this comment, but that's what I'm getting from this conversation.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. And that's one of the reasons why I think nations legislate the use of, ICAO Doc 9303 compliant machine readable travel documents, because it's a very controlled, closed ecosystem that they don't have to worry about non-government entities polluting the ecosystem or breaking security and things like that.
Yeah, so you have less of an issue when it comes to validating like the authoritativeness and authority of issuers and stuff like that. It's just the governance is very set in stone today, and it's going to stay as it is, and you're not going to have any new kind of use cases or new scenarios that require further governance or further thinking. So it's very, again, from an adoption standpoint, probably makes it easier.
Yeah, I would agree.
Thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed these conversations as much as I do. If you haven't already, make sure you subscribe to this podcast on the platform of your choice to make sure you're notified of new episodes that may be of interest to you. If you're looking to connect, feel free to reach out directly to me on LinkedIn or Twitter. Catch you all later.